Thank you very much indeed for joining us for the final panel session of the second day of the Decarbonisation Summit, and I'm delighted to say we are addressing the highly interesting subject of district heating. 17,000 heat networks in the UK, and nearly 500,000 of them million connections according to the Energy Saving Trust, the government body. So a big area for our discussion today. It's been widely reported that district heating is a vital next step in reducing carbon emissions in homes and commercial buildings. So we'll explore the barriers and the opportunities on that transition. I'm delighted to say that joining us on the panel, we have Jodie Pitway, Senior Director for Heat Networks at SSE, Cantor Mock, the Head of Market Growth for Heat Networks at BEIS, the government agency, and Caroline Bragg, Policy Director at the Association for Decentralised Energy. So a nice combination of government and industry body and the commercial sector. To start off with, as my normal format, if I could just ask each of you to give a quick sense of the work that you do in the context of decarbonisation. So Cantor, would you mind starting with that, please?
Yeah, no problem. So it's great to be here. I'm really focused on how we enable an environment that allows both the private sector and local authorities to come together to accelerate the delivery of heat networks. So we're currently around 2% of heat demand through heat networks, potential of around 20%. To deliver that in the next decades requires a real acceleration. So how do we create that market? And that's what we're focused on at BEIS, is what we can do to enable that to happen.
Very good. I'm sure there'll be some interesting questions around that on the policy side, but we'll come on to that. Caroline, please give me give us all some insights into your work, please.
Sure. So hello everyone, thank you very much for having me today. So as you mentioned, the association is a trade body representing heat networks as well as decentralised, decarbonised solutions more generally, including flexibility and energy efficiency. I think a lot of what my role entails in terms of district heating is helping the industry to find some consensus on how we need to move forward in terms of policy and regulatory reform, and also how we can help government and industry to talk together on some of the challenges we're still facing.
Very good. And Jodie, I know this is a key area of interest for SSE. Please give us some insights and in the context of a decarbonisation framework of ideas, please.
Oh, sure, yeah. Thanks for having me here today. Yeah, so I look after our heat networks business. So we've got 18 networks out there at the moment, looking after about 12,000 residential customers, about 200 commercial customers. But really what we want to do is to be investing significantly in new networks, working with public sector partners, private sector partners to invest, build and operate these networks and the proper expansive citywide networks of the future. So that's my main aim really, is to try and secure as much of SSE's wider investment into low carbon, into heat networks as possible. And the other big part of the job is working with BEIS, Scottish Government and the trade associations on the policy development, because as I'm sure we'll talk about today, it's absolutely critical for the success of this sector.
Very good. So Cantor, I know there are different ways of analysing what district heating is. There's a kind of threefold approach to some of the frameworks around district heating. Would you mind just giving us an understanding of the subject matter, please?
Yeah, sure. So district heating comes down to the fact that it's ultimately a communal way of heating property. So we can do that in an individual building, what we call a communal heat network. We can do this on a sort of a campus-based approach. So the place we're sitting in at the moment, where they've installed their heat network, due to go live in the next couple of weeks, I think. And then we can also look at that at district scale. So we look at multiple buildings across a large expanse happening. And they all offer benefits. And different ones for different places. And we talked a lot about a place-based approach yesterday. But certainly for city centres, district heat networks are a real opportunity, both to enable people to use their local sources of heat, so the aquifer here is one example, but also to use the sort of density that they've got of people together to be able to distribute heat amongst multiple properties, ultimately at the lowest cost, we think, and as the Climate Change Committee has identified, at lowest cost pathway to net zero.
Yeah. Jodie, is SSE addressing all three of those areas in its work?
Sure, yeah. So I think it's, as Cantor says, it's trying to make local energy affordable, it's reducing carbon, and it's providing local resilience. So, core benefits of what these networks can provide. And I think a key area where we are at the moment is we're transitioning away from natural gas CHP as being the primary energy source for these networks, tried and tested, low cost relatively for customers, into, as Cantor says, harnessing new forms of energy, so waste and recoverable heat sources. So the challenge for us and the sector generally is how to access those sources of heat as affordably as possible, because they're plentiful, as we talked about yesterday. They're plentiful, but they're not always easy to access. So I think a big part of what we're focused on is how we can access them, where we can try to standardise the way we access those cheap, plentiful sources of heat, so we can distribute them and keep heat bills down.
Thanks. And Caroline, from an industry body perspective, are all three of those areas ones we should focus on, or is there a sweet spot for decarbonisation that we should really address first and foremost?
I guess the nuance that we see is that all three will probably play quite a strong role actually in getting to the 18% of heat demand met by heat networks in the UK by 2050. I guess where we've been in the UK to date is that there has been a much greater focus on smaller communal schemes, perhaps in a single building, for example. And in the market at the minute, we see some campus schemes going forward too. What we don't see is the scale that you might get in other parts of Europe with these very big district schemes that Cantor and Jodie were talking about. And at least from, I think, a policy perspective, from a more commercial perspective, that's probably the area that needs a bit more push at the minute.
Yeah, so I was just wondering that, we've had the Heat Network Investment Project. I think it's brought forward about 30 projects at scale. We've got the Green Heat Network Fund. I mean, what other things would you say we need to sort of bring forward that network at scale?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, as you say, the capital support's been excellent, and there's been some really interesting projects being funded by that. And I think the way that BEIS has enabled the market to access that funding has been very market friendly. I think generally it's been designed to be as accessible as possible, probably. Probably what I think we need to see is something that helps low carbon heat be at least no more expensive than natural gas heat, effectively. So we can build the infrastructure with some of the capital support we've got at the moment. Sometimes we don't need any, but we also need to make sure the heat we're providing is affordable for customers, and that may need for a period of time, some ongoing support to support operating costs.
So people always want more from government, don't they? Even though government may be doing quite a good job. So what specifically do you want to see government to do to incentivise those cost comparisons?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few ways of looking at it. I suppose one of the proposals on the table at the moment is potentially a sort of a contracts for difference type approach, or an auction approach, where you potentially bid in for some support in terms of the revenue from your heat sales. And because it's an auction, those bidding in for the lowest values would do best. And I don't want to give the impression that this is a sector that needs subsidy. Absolutely, it's not across the board. There are projects that we're doing right now with higher grade sources of waste heat, where we can deliver heat significantly cheaper than natural gas pre-energy price crisis. So that doesn't need subsidy. But I think to support the sector as a whole, I think those sorts of mechanisms that give us some ongoing revenue support for a period of time, I think are important.
Yeah, Council, could you just give an outline of where the current policy framework is, the recent changes, and if you have any insights into what's coming down the track? Of course, we'd all be delighted to hear that, but just give a mapping out of where policy and government thinking is at the moment on district heating, please.
Yeah, so happy to do that. I think one of the things that we hear a lot from the sector is it is difficult to get heat networks to happen at scale because of the amount of conversations that you need to have. You need to get so many contracts over the line. So one of the things we're very focused on bringing forward is heat network zoning. I think it speaks quite well to what the mayors were talking about yesterday in terms of giving local authorities an ability to direct people to the best opportunity. And the heat network zone is the concept that you identify. And like this area, a heat network is the preferred net zero solution, so a really clear signal. So that's one thing. The other thing is that the market is broadly unregulated at the moment compared to the other two utility sectors. So very happy to see in the energy bill that we have the market framework coming forward. It will do three key things. One is it'll bring forward standards for networks, so hopefully improve the performance of networks. It will give consumers equivalent rights to other consumers in the energy space. And finally, it will give the utility providers provisions to have the same ability to take forward networks that other utility providers provide. For example, at the moment, they can't necessarily get access to the same land that current utility providers can do. So those are two big things that we're really focused on. And then there's continuing support for how do we enable networks happen at scale. And this issue that Jodie's identified is we want low carbon networks, but we live in a world where predominantly most people are on fossil fuels. That isn't a place that's equitable in terms of costs. So how do we facilitate that? And we're talking to the industry about what the best mechanisms are to achieve that.
What are the best mechanisms that you're suggesting to Cantor then, Carolyn?
I guess perhaps what I would add, I think, is so zoning and market framework we are actually very supportive of and have been for some time. I think what we see and what BEIS themselves would say is that zoning will only get you so far to where we think the true potential of this sector is. So government's own impact assessment would say that it gets you to about 7-8% of total heat demand, and that's with very high rates of domestic retrofit connections to heat networks. So I think there are a couple of things I think that we need to start thinking about over the next few years, particularly given the growth that we need to see. The first thing is probably why is there that discrepancy in terms of the level of impact that zoning would make, and what do we need to go even further? Other utility infrastructures, for example, have regulated asset bases, which is a way of reducing the risk for very large strategic infrastructure. And obviously we've now got the UK Infrastructure Bank with a mandate that includes heat networks. So I think there's a conversation to be had there about how we could further expand the role, say, of the UKIB in reducing some of the risks that you guys face. I think the other side as well is that whilst zoning and the market framework will help non-domestic buildings to make connections where it's the most cost-effective route for them, I don't think we've yet had enough of a discussion about domestic retrofit and how that works within heat network zones. And obviously with kind of ongoing discussions about rebalancing of levies and the energy price crisis at the minute, I think that's still an area that needs a bit more work.
Very good. It'd be good to get some sense of what these projects actually look like on the ground. We know there's an interesting aquifer-led initiative here at the Science and Industry Museum. That's one super exciting project, but it'd be great to get an example of an individual on-the-ground project to put some colour into this subject. So Cantor, can you give us an example of an exciting maybe in each of the three areas? Maybe you could each focus on one of the areas. So would you like to give us a sense of an exciting project on the ground, please?
Yeah, so I'll give you three. So really nice. Three, yeah, for bonus.
Government giveaway.
So I think really exciting to see GTC, a company coming forward with a air source heat pump solution for new build that they've just announced working with Taylor Wimpey. So that's really driven by the Future Home Standard and the changes away from gas. Exciting to see that as a concept because we've always looked at the sort of new build, sort of low density as difficult to do, but they're coming forward with an idea. In Swaffham Prior, really interesting local solution for a village on a sort of a shared ground loop setup, which we've supported. And once again, innovative, local community taking some action. We've been able to support that. So
where
really
is
good.
That village?
It's near Cambridge. In Cambridge.
Okay.
And the final one that I would point out is there's one here in the Tower of Light, I think it's called. It's a gas-fired CHP network, but an example of a heat network going forward here, and quite interesting in terms of how they've made an iconic design and sort of nestled it right in the middle of the city centre. Okay,
very good. Thanks so much. Is there a particularly strong sustainability, decarbonisation-led example that you could share with us, Carolyn?
So maybe many of people were there as well. I went to All Energy 2 weeks ago, and obviously one of the gorgeous heat network projects that they have in Glasgow is the Queen's Quay project, which Dave Pearson will be very happy to show you around if you want to ask him. But it's a wonderful project because it's basically using the ambient temperature of the River Clyde to help boost the efficiency of the very large heat pumps that they have in order to reduce the cost of the entire network. It's really quite an innovative design with actually this huge expansion potential right across this new sort of regeneration area, which is really quite exciting, whilst also kind of, I think, it kind of shows actually where we need to get to, because water source could be as much as, say, sort of maybe 2/3, maybe even a half of where some of these heat networks that we need in future need to go. So it's quite a trailblazer.
Very good, exciting stuff. Jodie, from your world of experience at SSE?
Yeah, I guess a couple to flag up. And these are both examples of this, this new world of capturing waste heat. So a project with the University of Surrey, who I think are here today, or were here yesterday. which is effectively retrofitting air source heat pump, centralised air source heat pump, to replace existing gas boiler plant, hand in hand potentially with some building modifications in terms of temperature regime within those buildings. That also has the potential, which obviously isn't the case for every site, but for a new solar array, which will feed in and supply site demand as well as the heat pump. So really nice kind of whole system thinking, that kind of integrated solution. So some of the guys in the business sort of calling it plug and play. It's obviously a lot more complex than that, but our idea really is that we can deliver low carbon energy source in an energy centre, might be prefabricated, capturing where we can local waste ambient heat sources and plugging into existing energy centres. So that model I think is really replicable. The other one to touch on very quickly is a project which I think we've announced today, which is in Leeds, which is capturing high grade heat from our energy from waste plant, which will be commissioned in 2025. And we've got a really large heat load nearby with Yorkshire Water. It's a treatment facility, wastewater treatment facility, so producing biogas there. I mean, it's a very happy coincidence of a fantastic surplus heat supply with a very high heat load density, but that gives us an anchor to potentially expand to a wider area around there. And in time, who knows, Leeds City Council have been fantastic in helping sort of facilitate and enable that. A potential connection into the Leeds Pipes project, which is obviously there already, to provide a bit of resilience, a bit more low carbon heat into that network. And then we're starting to get, I think, to the kind of networks that, we see in Scandinavia and other parts of Europe, which are properly citywide, have the ability to connect in residential properties as well as they run through, through the city. So yeah. Embryonic, but the start of something big there, hopefully.
Very good. Thanks for bringing to life some of those real-world, tangible examples. I wonder, is there a sense of sort of perception gap that this is somehow something that the mainland Europeans do, and this isn't something that the British do because we're very much based on a more individual sense of powering and heating our buildings and homes, or not? Do you get the sense that that's a problem you have to face, or not?
Interested in Jodie's view. He's often out there in the cold face trying to get customers across the line.
I think, I don't think it's an individualistic attitude. I think the barriers are potentially around monopoly and novelty.
Right.
I think it's novel for the vast majority of people in this country. And we've got experience of replacing existing heating systems with known energy bills with a new heat network, which is a monopoly supply from, in our case, hopefully an understood and a known energy supplier, and a very different setup. And so I think that concept of monopoly is a challenge for some people that we need to think about.
You just outlined some really exciting examples. Is that almost the kind of hindrance that it's seen as a novelty because they're so exciting and dynamic and creative, these solutions?
Yeah, I hope they're seen more widely as not as exciting. I know we do in the sector, but whether there's a sort of a customer perception issue there that we need to overcome.
I think for what we see, that there are other examples, some great examples in London. Southwark are doing some great work with Veolia there on a sort of district heat network. Vattenfall are doing some really good work in Bexley, that sort of area, and they've really got a really grand scale of what they want to do. And then Energetic doing some great work in North London. I mean, and there are others around the country. I think there is a bit of a holdback in terms of there are two things. I think people are given lots of solutions, aren't they? When we just heard yesterday, you talk about, it's quite confusing for people to know what the right solution is. So I think, we as government and working with trade associations, listening to the Heat Pump Federation yesterday, need to help direct people. That's the one thing, because we do have a predominant solution, which is an individual one. So that's the one area. And then, how do we make this replicable? Is that what Jodie was saying is really important, so that people recognize, okay, this is the same, it's been done before, which is more common in Europe than it is here. But I think it's happening. There are more projects coming forward, and hopefully that will be able to develop that momentum. Yeah, very good.
Yeah. We noticed some definite enthusiasm from some of the mayors yesterday for some of these initiatives. Is there real enthusiasm in some areas but less in other areas with local authorities? Is that an issue you face in the sector?
Yeah. I think it is a bit, and often I think it comes down, many things to local authorities in terms of perhaps capacity and where sort of political priorities are. We talk to some local authorities who are absolutely committed to heat networks, perhaps already have developed them or in the process of developing them, and are actually quite far forward, with kind of a substantial team to take it forward. I talk to other local authorities where it's half a sustainability officer who's trying to put together their plan and identify where a heat network could go, and that's far more difficult for that person to get the political buy-in that they need, because this is important local infrastructure, but also heat networks are complex. They're more complex than, say, for example, a solar farm, for example, and perhaps, as Cantor was saying, less sort of cookie cutter at the minute, which also kind of, I think, perhaps aggravates the resource challenge.
So as an industry body, what do you do to address those gaps of knowledge, understanding and capacity at certain local levels?
As a trade association, we try to support where we can. I guess we're a bit limited. We've been working with others who are doing things, for example, with the Catapult has their ERIS program at the minute, which is all about boosting the capability of the local authorities, also trying to support. There are forums that exist so that local authorities can share the knowledge that they have and work with each other, and we support those.
I think maybe just picking up Caroline's point there about buy-in, and that's sort of the need for a local champion and sort of a locally led project. We got this thing where we sort of say start small but think big with these projects, because, as Caroline rightly says, they're complex beasts, and you've got lots of stakeholders to line up. So I guess for a local authority that has some ambition, there are a lot of stakeholders to bring on board. And there's also, we don't have one model, one way of delivering heat networks in this country. There's multiple ownership options, there's different delivery routes. And so the local authority's got to go through that process of understanding what risks they want to keep on board themselves, what they want to outsource, and what that business model looks like as a result. And there's probably going to be lots of different views on what that looks like within the local authority. So I think to Caroline's point about capacity, you need the champion, I think, in our experience, and you also need the resource around them to bring people along within the local authority wider area, to make stuff happen.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think we often look at local authorities as this one homogenous group, but they're all different. They have different capacities within them. They have different passions and things that they're moving on. I think we got a bit of a sense of that from the mayors yesterday, in terms of there are some things they're aligned on and some things that are more sort of relevant for them. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do is work with the Heat Network Industry Council, which is a group of sort of big investors in the space, and SC, a part of that, is giving local authorities options so they don't have to invent everything themselves. So how could you go about supporting a heat network depending on what it is that you have in terms of capacity? How do you want to lead it? And I don't know if either of you have reflections on sort of that, giving local authority or enabling local authorities to choose from a range of options to make it easier for them.
I would definitely think choice is important. It's part of the issue, but I think it's important we have it. And I think I'm probably picking up one key point around that, I think, is how do we help, if a local authority wants to sponsor and develop and lead a project and not outsource it in its entirety to the private sector, which it could still do, but if it wants to do that, how do we enable them to go through a sort of risk assessment process and bring the private sector on board early in the development process, so the private sector can help develop, steer, invest, all those good things. That at the moment, I think, is maybe a bit of a gap in terms of how we procure these networks. And what we find is local authorities, on occasion will go quite a long way down a development route, spend quite a lot of money for a tender process, then comes to market and it's quite expensive for people to bid into. So if we can move that procurement point earlier in the process, and that local authority can bring on a partner earlier, that could potentially be a solution to unlocking some of those problems that projects rather that have kind of got stuck in development stages.
Exactly. I think as well, isn't it, it's about also kind of, I think, contextualising where heat networks are the best solution, the most cost effective in a broader view of what you need to do regionally, which obviously Manchester is great at, is already moving forward with its local area energy planning. But if you look, for example, at where the discussion has got to in Scotland, there is lots of discussion now about the National Energy Agency, which will be a new body owned by the government, but could provide actually this kind of helping coordinating and standardizing some of those ways of developing where you need to go to a local area and then kind of moving forward with the projects you want to take forward, which is actually quite an interesting and probably very welcome development.
The energy crisis is clearly focusing everybody's minds at the moment, and perhaps this is the first time we're really truly placing a value on the cost of energy. So cost is clearly a key issue. How are you seeing that play out in the sector? Cantor, one for you.
Yeah, so for us, I think we see it in two main ways. The one is for existing heat networks, and particularly for poorer performing ones, there are some people with some real issues, you know, as we see across the country, and we'll have some issues going into the winter, and we're doing a lot working across government to make sure that they're included in the government packages of support and to deal with that, and we've certainly been talking to people about that, so that's real. We've also got the Heat Network Efficiency Scheme, which is looking at how do we try and change some of those poorly performing networks and get better performance out of them. So that's one area that we're working. In some way, it makes a little bit of difference, but I mean, Jodie's the person to speak to about this, about the economics of heat networks. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, as the prices go up, it gives them, certainly a low carbon network, it makes them a little bit more competitive, but not necessarily right to that place. So it's a bit of a mixed blessing, I think, depending on where you are. New networks probably not a completely bad thing, because it gives them, certainly on a low carbon side, an opportunity to compete. But on existing networks, and particularly poorly performing existing networks, really bad for consumers.
Jodie, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess I'm talking from the perspective of most of our networks are natural gas CHP. So our pricing structure is effectively that we match the prevailing gas prices, so or beat them. So effectively, you know, our customers have seen rises that are commensurate with prices in domestic gas market. So they are, you know, feeling the same issues as everyone else on the gas tariffs. But they're kind of protected from the volatility that we're seeing in the market. So from that point of view, there is hopefully some benefit. But I think it's really focusing and it's changed conversations with potential off-takers of heat from new heat networks, where you've got a heat source that is of a higher temperature but needs less electrification to get it to the customer at a usable temperature, that's locally produced and is removed completely from gas price volatility. And we're finding that some customers are prepared to pay a little premium for that at the moment. That resilience, I suppose, and that certainty in the pricing. Yeah. So that's new within the last 18 months. That conversation's changed. I think
it's a real opportunity there. And we know of some networks that some networks based on energy from waste plants that are giving lower than retail price index rises to their customers. So this opportunity to disconnect a network from the fossil fuels is, you know, really key to our sort of energy strategy, and something that heat networks can bring that others sort of solutions don't necessarily bring in the short term.
Yeah, Caroline, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, just to echo, I think Cantor's point. I think what we see across the sector is there is a real range in the impact it's having. That's dependent upon the age of the heat network, perhaps also dependent upon the size, how the procurement of gas, if it is gas, is managed. There are some parts of the sector that are being disproportionately impacted, and where the situation is concerning. But we're working with government very constructively at the minute to try to address that. And just more than that, I think, especially when you look, not to bang on about Europe all the time, but if you look at other European countries, they have taken a step forward by saying, actually, you know what, this just further pushes the need to double down on heat networks. They are the way to get ourselves off the international volatility that we see in the gas market, which is actually really positive. So if we go in a similar direction, all to the good.
A common theme across the 2 days is that a crisis accelerates the future. A less than common theme has been that government is being very supportive. So you're going great guns on this subject, Cantor. So we'll open up now to questions from our online audience. Who has a first question for our panel, please? There's one in the centre at the back there. Thanks very much. If you could say your name, where you're from, and if your question is directed to someone in particular, do let us know, please.
Thanks very much. Andrew Hunt from Oldham Council. Question for Cantor, probably, actually. We're trying to, we're looking to develop a mine water district heat network for Oldham Town Centre. And, you know, of course, this would be a low carbon source of heat. But low carbon generally requires innovation, and with innovation comes risk. So, we've had some feasibility studies done by the Coal Authority that indicates, they've given us a preferred site. They think we can get 4 megawatts of heat out of it, but until we start drilling holes in the ground, we're not going to know. And of course, with the drilling the holes in the ground is going to come a cost, and there's a risk that it's not going to be feasible. So, just thinking from the BEIS perspective, and this is just one example of risk in developing low carbon heat sources. Who do BEIS think is best placed to actually absorb this risk or shoulder this risk? Because of course, local authorities, we want to see this stuff happen, but we're not heat network developers. We're not engineers. We want to be facilitators. We want to make it happen, but there is this. It depends on what appetite for risk the local authority actually has. So, just wondering about your thoughts on that, really.
Yeah. So, mine water heat is proving to be a really interesting and great area for work. And we've got some projects that are going ahead with some of our funding. But their big risk is that drilling risk. And although we have schemes designed to support, so we've got the Green Heat Network Fund, for example, which has come out, and it's designed to help support these lower carbon technologies, because we recognize that there's going to be a period of learning and standardizing the approaches here. And I think it's really good in that it will focus on that, but it's not perfect for all. And it's not perfect to deal with that particular risk around mine water and also with deep geothermal. So we are working with a broad range of people to look at what we can do. There's some really interesting examples looking across Europe. So Europe has done some really good work in different places, but also we can learn from that. So the Paris Basin, for example, has done some work on a product to manage that risk, and that's one thing we're looking at. So in many ways, we think it is for us as government to bring people together and look at what our choices are, working with some of the investment community to see, well, what can we bring forward private sector products? Because although it's very tempting always to have government solutions and government funding, it means that you don't have government funding for something else. So one of the things we're really looking at is how do we bring forward different sources of funding, whether we can get the UK Investment Bank, other ways to help local authorities manage this risk. And I don't actually think local authorities, but help the person who develops the scheme manage this risk. Because if you look at, and that's probably the way I would summarize it. But it is a real risk, we acknowledge it, and we're working on it.
On the investment piece, we know that across the sector, flows of capital are really coming into the sustainability and decarbonisation sectors. But do you see these flows coming into the district heating space in particular? Is that a good direction of travel at the moment?
Yes, I think they're very promising for the district heating sector, because actually these are infrastructure projects. If we get them right and set them up, they're long-term revenue and with a stable client base, so they really are good. The issue at the moment is managing that risk and the return that needs to go along with that. And so that's probably the thing that's holding us back at the moment. I think there are a few things. So regulation will really help. We're told it provides a clearer framework. Yep. I think zoning will help in terms of mitigate some of those connection uncertainties and the coordination uncertainties. So, I think it's promising, but we find ourselves where we are now, and people having to make decisions. So, I think we're going in the right direction. Yep. There's certainly a lot of interest.
Yep. Jodie, without wishing to put you on the spot, but of the 24 billion that SSE is assigning by 2030 to the sector as a whole, do you have a sense of what slice of that pie is going into district heating?
3/4 would be nice, wouldn't it? Yeah. The funds will be available if we can show the projects are there. Is a short answer. So we can gain access for these projects to SSE Finance, obviously based on business cases and based on a pipeline. We can show a pipeline, and we can show that each project has real potential for growth, genuine potential for growth. And I guess the point on risk, that's a risk area that SSE can take. So we may be not comfortable taking sort of below the ground risk, but in terms of how a network expands and who it connects to, those are the sorts of risks that we can look at. So if I can show a pipeline, I can show scale of opportunity, then SSE is more than happy to.
Right. So there's some project mapping exercise to be done, is there?
Sure. Yeah. We have to take a view to look at the overall potential size of the market. and what that's going to look like in 5 and 10 years' time, and then overlay onto that what projects we think we can be successful in, how much money we can invest as partnerships or go on our own, and then obviously sell that case internally. So there's no shortage of appetite to invest in it, we just need to show the pipeline.
Very good. Any more questions from the audience? A couple on the right here.
Hello, Patrick Doyle from Bouygues Energies and Services. Just to expand on something Jody said, that's probably going to relate to a question for Cantor. We're actually the contractor on Swaffham Prior, which is a great project, like a heat network using a series of boreholes, air source heat pumps, ground source heat pumps. It's actually taken a whole village off of oil. There wasn't even a gas line, so the carbon impact is brilliant. In tandem, we're doing a solar farm that's going to power the heat network project, and so it's really a green project. But we've been engaged with Cambridgeshire County Council for a very long time, developing this, making this feasible, aligned with what you said, Jody, about that early engagement. You know, we're expected to take the risk on that and design it, so we really need it to be in the door early. We don't want to be bidding on stuff, inheriting other designs, and then having to guarantee the risks and design and performance with it. So I guess, is there a way to sort of streamline procurement here for the local authorities to appoint specialists, so it's not just TAs coming in early specifying a project that then needs to be inherited and guaranteed by another? Is there a way to fast track this? I guess we're working on a 4-year framework agreement with Cambridge, which really allowed Swaffham Prior to accelerate and grow. Is that the approach that needs to be taken, or do you suggest any other methods for local authorities in the room?
Who would like to go with that one first?
I'm happy to, I guess my thoughts on that would be that sometimes we see that projects have been quite highly, I think to your point there, quite highly specified, highly developed before they come to market. And when they come to market, the market might want to do something a bit different with them. So there's money been spent that didn't need to be there on both sides of the procurement. So I guess some earlier points of earlier procurement, but I think it's potentially flagging up the Beehive framework potentially looks like an interesting way for contracting authorities to be able to access investment and development partners earlier in the process. I think that could be really interesting. And maybe being a bit less defined about the scope of what's being procured. Come and give me some carbon savings and guarantee a heat price for me of this or lower. Tell me how you're going to do it. Do that earlier in the process potentially is one way of doing it.
So, I mean, these are really good questions, because you are, all picking up some of the areas of challenge that we need to deal with. Now, in this particular area of challenge, from a central government perspective, we need to balance two things. We heard very strongly yesterday from the mayors about control, the ability to have that local authority. So from a central government perspective, we don't want to be saying to local authorities, this is the way you must do it. And that's why we're really focusing on giving the options a choice, and that is what we're looking at. So, but the difficulty is we speak to you as an individual, we speak to another company, and they will all want slightly different things. So this is why we're quite excited by the Industry Council, where we've brought together a few of the bigger players, and we're asking them, so let's come up with a range of options that would work for the private sector, and then we can start talking to local authorities about this being your suite of options, because ultimately it comes down to the local authority making the choice that's right for them, because they are best placed from a place perspective. So that's the current way we're looking at it. We're also trying to open up the procurement a little bit. So last month we published the first version of a procurement pipeline, so giving companies an opportunity to see at an early stage that procurement is coming down the line, so that you don't just wait for the tender and then be able to reply. Hopefully enabling companies to plan, actually we can invest in this space. And it was quite nice to see, as part of the procurement pipeline, the companies part of the council invested about 300 million over the last 2 years in heat networks. So it gives people a feel for the size of the sector. So steps towards making it right, and hopefully, in a year's time, we'll be able to say, actually, they're out there, the options are out there, and I'd be able to answer your question more directly, say, this is the choice.
Very good. Caroline, would you like to pick up on this one?
Perhaps actually as a question, I think, obviously the Bristol Leap has chosen a kind of earlier procurement model and providing kind of low-cost finance with it. I guess, I don't know how people feel about Is that the right way to go, or do you think that puts too much risk on the local authority at this point?
Good question. I think the overall model is really interesting, and I think that's probably what we're advocating for, is to bring a partner on earlier. I think one of the challenges is how much you put into that partnership. How far and wide you take your local energy systems and bring in a small number of partners to deliver those. And that's obviously, as Cantor says, part of the work of HNIC, I think, be to draw some sensible lines around the heat network and the local, perhaps, electricity integration. Where do we define what the project is that you're procuring? And then bring a partner on to do that earlier.
We might see the relationship, I think, change once we have zoning coordinators who may be local authorities, or they might be something else entirely. It might change the commercial relationship between a zoning coordinator, local authority, and the kind of projects they're developing. I
think Bristol Leap's really good, but it's big, isn't it? I mean, so I doubt for the firm that's just asked the question, it would be the answer, because it's at such a scale that you have to really be a big firm and partnership. But Worthing have just done a concessionary model, which I think is another really interesting thing, where it's much earlier in the line, and they're putting a concession out there. So the models are emerging. I think we can do some more work on them.
Very good. I think that we've got time for one final question. I think there's another question coming on the right there, waiting for the microphone.
Yes,
fire away.
For the microphone after being told off previously. Beam Land Heat Pump Federation, thank you for the name check, Cantor. I've got a couple of sort of planning type points, and I agree with the champions bit, Jodie. Champions at all levels, so champions within local authorities, but also champions in the street, on a street by street approach. So two things on the sort of planning front first. Would it be helpful if we were to recognise waste heat and waste coolth as a pollutant? And then that puts an obligation on the owners of those pollutants to do something with them, which could then involve passing some of the risk to the owners of the pollutant to say, actually, you've got an obligation to do something with that, so that passes some risk. I've got a plea on planning, which ties into what we discussed yesterday about making mistakes. At the moment, we have got a problem where some local authorities are preventing fifth generation ambient loop networks going in because they think they might have a fourth generation network going in 5 years' time. That's nonsense, because they're interoperable. We've got to get away from that sort of problem. And then my final point I would make about choice and consumer choice. I spoke to a young lady who is on secondment from Sweden, I think she lived in. And she said she was sitting in her house in London and she was freezing cold. I said, well, why are you freezing cold? She said, well, I'm waiting for the boiler to come on. She said, if I was at home in Sweden, I'd be hot all day because I'm on a heat network. I said, well, this is consumer choice. You can choose it. She said, I'd much rather be on my network. Thanks very much. So I think that we overblow this consumer choice bit. Yes, we've got to protect against monopolies, but actually, most people would choose to be comfortable.
I think that was more of a position point, Bean, than your contribution is always very gratefully received.
The question about planning is a real one, and I appreciate that planning is not with BEIS, but there needs to be some influence from BEIS to make sure we do not put up barriers to what are really, really good projects because of some artificial thought by only one or two people, one or two individuals who've got this thing that says, oh, you can't interoperate a fourth and fifth generation network. Absolutely you can.
The sentiment towards BEIS was going so very well up until that point. I'll leave it on a positive note as we're running out of time. On the subject of champions, this afternoon we're joined by a real live champion, a Paralympic champion. Dame Sarah Story will be joining us on the active travel panel. And then the first panel after lunch will be on the subject, which I'm sure will continue some of the themes discussed here, jobs, skills and opportunities. But for now, thank you very, very much indeed for our panel discussion on this super exciting and important subject of district heating. Thank you very much indeed for providing such great contributions, and to the audience for those interesting and insightful questions. We break now for an hour for some power sustainable networking, so please do get involved in that. But for now, thank you very much indeed, panel. Thank you.